Batterer intervention programs, especially those that have a fatherhood component, can be extremely valuable for child welfare. But once those fathers are engaged, then what? Even like the best workers, is not their job to change the person, but maybe to motivate the person to change. And then this is where batterer intervention programs come in.
Welcome to this season of the Institute's Child Welfare Podcast. This season, we're exploring the complex and deeply human work that happens at the intersection of child welfare and domestic violence serving systems. In cases involving intimate partner violence, professionals across these systems each bring unique roles, responsibilities, and lived experiences to the table. Those differences can create tension, but they can also spark new understanding, deeper empathy, and more coordinated responses for families. Today, we're joined by Juan Carlos Areán from Futures Without Violence. Juan Carlos works to engage individuals who have caused harm and promote accountability and change through intervention programs. Thank you so much for being here, Juan Carlos.
My pleasures. Thank you for inviting me, Lisa.
Of course. So I'd love for you to just start by telling us a bit about your professional background in providing services to those who cause harm. Maybe talk a little bit about what batterer intervention is and then what your current role is.
Absolutely. It's actually interesting because I have a PhD, but not related to this particular issue. I have a master's of music and a PhD in religious studies. And I have worked in this field for 35 years now. So everything I know, I have learned outside school, pretty much, from practice, from mentors. You know, when I started these kinds of programs, the battering intervention programs were just getting started. So I was lucky enough to be part of folks that were able to shape them in some way. So you were asking about battering intervention programs. So these are programs for people who cause harm, and maybe a note in the language. The language really has evolved through the years. We used to say batterers, offenders, perpetrators, and some people do that too, and that's totally okay. You know, this is not the language police. But the field has moved slowly towards people first language without sugarcoating the harm and the damage. So we went from men who batter to people who use violence to people who cause harm. It seems like for now that's where people have settled, and that's the term I use. But again, you can use whatever term you want. And the programs themselves are called different things in different places, but most commonly known as batterers or battering intervention programs, because I think a key thing for me separating the actions from the personhood, you know, that's what opens the possibility for change. These programs actually started in the 70s, so they've been around for almost 50 years. Started just very grassroots. One of the first programs was here in Boston, where I live in Emerge. There was one in Denver, one in Washington State. And they, as I said, have evolved through the years. They started to proliferate. And right now, there's probably thousands of them in the country. We don't know for sure because there's not a central place to coordinate in any way how the programs operate. It's more by state, but even then, it's hard to have an actual count of it. And these programs were basically designed to work with individuals who cause harm at the beginning, at the request from mainly women who have experienced domestic violence and wanted something done with the guys. So I might use some gender language here, recognizing that domestic violence can be experienced by anyone from any gender and can be used by anyone from any gender. And the majority and the most severe kinds of violence usually come from men to women. So, and certainly back then in the 70s, 80s, 90s, pretty much it was very gendered. There were no programs for women who cause harm. There were not services for men who experience domestic violence, and probably nothing on LGBTQ populations at that point.
Thank you so much. I know that you've shifted out of sort of the direct service provision, but can you talk a little bit about what your role is now?
So, yeah, I worked in a program for about 12 years in Western Massachusetts, and that's really where I learned the ropes. And it was an interesting program because, again, it was very grassroots, and it was a program where at the beginning we only accepted individuals that basically were past the denial, that recognized that they had a problem and needed to be helped. And the majority of them were not mandated by a court or child welfare, which even now is unusual in the United States. But that created an interesting culture when we started taking mandated individuals to, once we were certified, then we created what we call the culture of change. And so when mandated individuals arrived, they would see that some people went there on their own, and they're like, "Wow, what is this about?" And non-mandated individuals saw what the consequences could be if they didn't change their behavior. So it worked very well. And in the 12 years that I was there and ended up directing the program, we maintain like a 50-50 balance between mandated and non-mandated individuals. So after that, so I was in the western part of the state. My wife and I moved to Boston, and I was contacted by my present organization. It used to be called Family Violence Prevention Fund, and now it's called Futures Without Violence, to develop materials for battery intervention programs that had to do with fatherhood, the overlap of fatherhood and domestic violence. This was back in 2002. So it's been a long time that I've been doing this. And basically, I have continued to do that through this 20-something years. Has been a really interesting journey. And of course, I have learned a lot on the way. So what I do right now is mainly develop materials for the field and also offer training and technical assistance to folks in many different fields, not only battering intervention, but child welfare, courts, fatherhood programs, healthy marriage programs. Wherever they invite me, I will go.
Fantastic. And I think that, the focus on fatherhood is so interesting, in addition to there being, at least here in Florida, a pretty large focus on the importance of fatherhood, the role of fathers in their children's lives. There's definitely been I would say, a push for that here in Florida. There is research out there that shows that fathers who use harm against their partners are sometimes more motivated, or solely motivated initially, to change for their children. Does that resonate with you, with your practice?
Absolutely. And it's so interesting that you mentioned research, because when we started this project in 2002, there was no research about it, really, nothing. However, there was a lot of practice wisdom. And I think anyone who has worked with fathers who use violence realize that many of them, not all, but many of them, as you say, can be motivated to change when they realize the damage that they are doing to their children. So basically, through the love to their children, that's where the change can happen. So that's why I was so excited when I started this project with Futures. It used to be Fathering After Violence, actually. I was excited because even though there was a lot of practice wisdom around this, there were not like systematic ways in which battery intervention programs were engaging men through their parenthood, through their fatherhood. And the first thing that we did was do focus groups with mothers who had experienced violence, because all our work is survivor centered, right? And it was amazing. I think we did only 3 focus groups. It wasn't a big sample, maybe 19, 20 women, but it was almost universal. All but one women said that they would like, and they were not together with the fathers anymore. They were separated, but they would like that father to be involved in the lives of their children if it could be done safely, right? That's a key thing that we cannot leave out. So basically, overwhelmingly, we heard from mothers, and there is research that has been replicated this outcome, that that we need to be working with these folks, that it's important to create that relationship with the children. And most survivors, really what they want is the person to change, whether they stay or not with that person. So that created a great opportunity, and a lot of my work has been about creating strategies, if you will, and actual tools on how to engage fathers from that perspective.
That's wonderful. So there's clearly overlap with parenting. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about how interventions for those who cause harm do intersect with the child welfare world?
Yeah, I wish that there was more intersection. There's, depending on the location, some. So I feel that battering intervention programs, especially those that have a fatherhood component, can be extremely valuable for child welfare. Child welfare, of course, has to see all the members of the family, but by mandate, they have to engage fathers in some way that varies a lot from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But once those fathers are engaged, then what, right? I mean, even like the best workers, is not their job to change the person, but maybe to motivate the person to change. And then this is where battering intervention programs come in. Again, in some jurisdictions, there's a very close work relationship between child welfare and battering intervention programs. And there are, of course, referrals and follow-ups and so on. And there are even programs that specialize on fathers who are in the child welfare system. They are very rare, but there's one in New York City, for instance. There's one in North Carolina. But I think myself that child welfare can be really the perfect medium to help fathers to make that change. I have heard from workers once in a while, yes, but we don't have the teeth that a court, like criminal court, has, and so on. And said, you have plenty of teeth, because in my experience, most of the men that I work with would rather go to jail than lose custody or even visitation of their children, right? So we can connect those things in some way, and we have to be careful because measuring change is difficult. I think we could have a perfect accountability and support ecosystem for fathers to change.
I love that you said that, and we had Sarah Tedder on the podcast as well, who you met at our symposium last year, and she was speaking from the case management perspective, and I think what you're saying is so in alignment that case managers, we talked about them sort of being at the hub in child welfare, right? They're sort of the central hub, and then we have spokes going out to these different types of support systems based on which person or people that they're working with at any given time, because they have to know so many things that they can't be and shouldn't be expected to be the experts on all things. So to your point, as that hub and as that person that has a hopefully a rapport with the father, that they're able to make those connections and provide motivation, but knowing that there are services out there where there are experts like you who can provide that more in-depth support, ideally for change. So I just, it was very reminiscent of what Sarah and I were talking about the other day with really relying on our partners, which brings me to my next question. So collaboration is so key in this work, and I'm curious about who your primary partners are and what makes those partnerships effective.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. As I said before, from the place that I work right now, we try to work with as many partners as possible. But I'm part of the children and youth team at Futures Without Violence, which has focused a lot on child welfare through the years. There's some of my colleagues are really amazing experts. I have never worked on child welfare myself, but for instance, my friend and boss, Lana Davis, was the first co-located domestic violence advocate in the country back in the 1980s. And Shelley Taggart has incredible experience with that too. So one of the things that we're known for is working with professional athletes, for instance, and high school coaches. And so we have a wide scope of work, if you will. But I like to speak in particular at child welfare. So we do a lot of training on child welfare, and absolutely collaboration is at the center. Exactly what you're saying, Lisa, because we know workers are overwhelmed. It's one of the hardest jobs that I've ever seen, and I just respect child welfare workers so much for what they do and the decisions that they have to make and all of that. We always say what you said. You don't need to do it alone. You have community. Wherever you are, you have a community. You certainly will have services for survivors of domestic violence, and hopefully also domestic violence co-located advocates. I know that you do have those in Florida, but often the battering intervention programs are left outside, even the coordinated community responses, which are more about criminal responses, if you will. Often the battering intervention programs are left outside. But let me tell you, for your listeners, wherever you are, in Florida or beyond Florida, if you haven't contacted your local battering intervention programs, please do so, because there's so much expertise there and so much commitment to this work. And you can literally have them come do a training for your workers, give more information. One thing that I highly recommend for anyone, including workers, is to ask permission if they could witness one of the groups, actually, which is, I'm telling you, so many people tell me after that, it's like, wow, I never thought, they were going to be that way. And part of it is realizing that these guys are, regular guys, right? That with flaws and with strengths and so on. But I think that collaboration is so important. And one of the exciting things about child welfare that I have seen is that sometimes in some jurisdictions, child welfare subsidizes or pays for the program. One thing that you need to know about battery intervention programs is that there's almost no funding. There's a few states, I don't know, Florida for sure. There's a few states that do fund the programs, but very, very minimally. Most states don't give 1 cent, and private philanthropy, nothing. I mean, so these programs are self-sustaining, which is extremely difficult. So one of the common complaints that I hear, oh, they are really expensive, and most of them try to do a sliding scale, but still, for someone to pay $10 or $20 a week might be prohibitive. So what I've seen is that sometimes child welfare helps with that, and that's really, really helpful. So again, there's so many possibilities to do that. The other thing that I've seen is that here in Massachusetts, for instance, some of the child welfare organizations themselves might be running some programs for fathers, for instance, which is a really interesting idea. There's a couple of curricula out there. One is called Caring Dads, which focuses mainly on child abuse, but it's really, really good. So I've known workers that actually run programs either within the agency or outside the agency and continue that relationship that you were talking about that is so important.
Interesting. So it's almost like, in addition to co-located advocates, like a co-located program for those who use harm.
That would be fantastic if that was an opportunity. I don't know in the context of child welfare. I know that in the program that I work, at some point we got a little funding to put one of our staff in a criminal court. And when someone was arraigned, just even before conviction, this person would approach them and said, hey, there's a program here, like if you need help. And, that was one of the ways that people came non-mandated or right before being mandated.
That's so interesting. What is one thing that you wish other professionals understood about working with, I don't want to just say BIP providers, better intervention program providers, but working with those who work with those who cause harm?
Well, the first thing I want people to know is that there are a lot of programs out there, and some might be just a therapist that runs a group. Some might be a more established program. In general, I think that these programs, as I said before, are very committed, are very survivor-centered. Many require partner contact with the survivors so that really can see. I mean, that's probably the golden standard of knowing if a person is changing, right? Because self-disclosure is not necessarily the best way to do that. I want them to know that there are people out there. I want them to know that they struggle financially and to understand that perspective, and they still are doing the work. I mean, I know colleagues that have been doing the work for 20, 30, 40, and Emerge here, David Adams, is still doing groups, and he has been doing this for 48 years. It's really remarkable. So they're very, very committed. They are very open to that collaboration if that opens up. But the other thing that I wanted to people to know, because a question that often comes up is whether programs work, and that's a big question. What I want them to know is that people who cause harm can change. I know that. I've seen it. Now, these programs are not magical. They cannot make someone change. Nobody can make you change. You have to choose to change, right? And I think one way for people to change, if is if they found what my colleague Jim Henderson calls a wall of accountability. I like to call it a circle of accountability, in which every person who caused harm basically gets the same message, not only from a program, but from child welfare, from the courts, from their faith leader, from their doctor, And for me, the key part of this, I think that maybe there are four elements to it. One is I care about you. Two is you're harming your family, and because I care about you and I care about them, I will not let you do that. I'll help you not do that. Then there is help available. And fourth would be people can change. So if we all were in the same page about those messages, I think we would make a difference.
And I wanted to go back to something that you said earlier in our conversation around you've mentioned there's quite a few programs out there and available, but not really any type of, I don't want to say coordination, but not necessarily a unified way of knowing how these programs exist. And so, without those types of mechanisms that we might have for other types of services, human services, let's say, how would you recommend that workers go about finding these types of services in their community?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Most states have a certification process, so that's the easiest way to do it. If there's a certification process, then at least someone has looked at the curricula, the policies, and so on. It's a little tricky because most states don't have the means to really monitor programs, so certification, might be relative. Again, I think that if you're a worker in a certain community in Florida, say, what I would recommend, and I know you're super busy, but this will pay off in the long term. What I would recommend is do a little research about what programs are available. And if you called your coalition, for instance, your state coalition, I think there's two of them right now, they might tell you, okay, in Tallahassee, these are the programs that there are. So contact them and you can ask them whatever, how do you operate? Like, are you certified? Can I come see a group? If people tell you, no, you cannot come see the group and you cannot look at my policies, so like that would be a red flag for me. These groups are semi-confidential in terms of, I think part of the paradigm that we work on, and probably this is almost like a bumper sticker, like domestic violence feeds on silence, right? So part of the culture of the groups is that this is not a secret, right? Accountability is taking responsibility in some public way, right? It might be in a group setting or beyond. I'm very suspicious of programs where facilitators said, no, you cannot come to the program. There has to be transparency for programs, right? And, if you want to, you can do a little research about what curricula they use. Most programs use the so-called Duluth model or Duluth curriculum, but there are others. And establish that relationship with a person, meet with the program director if you can. And I'm saying that this will pay in the long term because then when you need help with someone who causes harm, you're a phone call away from that person and you can do a warm referral. The other thing that I want to mention, which is exciting and newish, is that now there's a national helpline for people who cause harm. For decades, we have had hotlines for victims and survivors, right? There's a national one, and every state and every locality has one. But starting in the pandemic, a group here in Massachusetts started a helpline. It's called A Call for Change. You can just Google it. And it's really a fantastic referral. They work with people, interestingly, anonymously, but they work with them to motivate them to change, to go to programs, to find support and so on. So I highly recommend that. They started in Massachusetts, it's expanding around the country, and there's a couple of other localities that are developing their own helplines. So it's an idea whose time has come. By the way, there's other countries that have had those helplines for decades, actually.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing that resource. And I think as many of those things as we know about and can get out there to our workers, I think the better so that they can, to your point, help make those connections, especially when sometimes resources are scarce. I wanted to ask you about this. I feel like a lot of times we see in child welfare part of the case plans will be for anger management as opposed to a batterer intervention program. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the distinction between those types of programs and sort of which purposes they serve or don't serve.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question because that is a common problem, not only in child welfare, but also in courts. Anger managements are programs that tend to be short, tend to work in certain skills for people. For instance, taking time outs, recognizing red flags, being aware of a negative self-talk. Nothing wrong with those tools. Battery intervention programs also use those tools. However, anger management really theoretically is based on the idea that anger is the problem. And people like me that work in battery intervention don't think that anger is the problem. If anyone has really taken even a basic course on domestic violence, we talk about the problem being coercive behavior, right? That's what is at the root of it. And what you want to do is work with the person on why are they coercive? Why are they controlling? What beliefs did they grow up with that are making them think that, for instance, especially men, have the right to have their way, and if not, they can use violence or abuse, right? Not only physical violence. Anger management programs don't even talk about things like sexual violence, but like cyber abuse, which is a big thing right now. But the main thing for me is that, yeah, I mean, it seems counterintuitive to say that anger is not the cause of the violence because it's an ingredient to it, but it's not causal. We all get angry, Lisa, right? And the majority of us don't become violent. And also, people who cause harm through domestic violence tend to be very targeted in their violence. Most of them are not violent out in the streets, in the bar, and that kind of thing. And maybe anger management is a good alternative for people to have brawls on the street and, maybe assault police officers. I don't know. That seems like a different category. But what you want is, first of all, an 8-week program, which most anger management are, or less. It might be a weekend. It's just not enough to do anything real. I mean, even the battery intervention programs, many of them are 24 weeks. That seems to me like kindergarten for something that people have been learning their whole lives. In some states, there are 52 weeks, for instance, in California. Here's 40 weeks. So one of it is duration, but more importantly is, yes, that orientation and like their theory of change and understanding of the causality of domestic violence. And since we're talking about this, one more thing is that there's also the misconception that substance abuse might cause domestic violence. And again, there's no causal things. Many people get drunk or use drugs and don't become violent. But both anger and substance abuse, and in some cases mental health, are basically gasoline to the fire of someone that already has in them an ideology of coercive control, if you will.
I think that's a really good distinction between those programs. Thank you so much. It's a really important line to draw, and I really appreciated the words that you used around these are ingredients to the issue, right? This is gasoline to the fire, but not necessarily that causal element. And so I think that's really important, especially in child welfare, where we do see a lot of co-occurring issues like mental health, substance use, and domestic violence. And so kind of being able to see how those relationships are very complicated between all of those things.
And they all need to be treated, Lisa, right?
Yes.
Someone that has those co-occurrences, they have 2 or 3 problems that need to be
Right.
addressed. But again, mental health per se, like being bipolar or, those kinds of things, those things don't cause domestic violence. There are plenty of bipolar people that are not violent, right?
Right. So in your line of work, from your vantage point, what does a successful outcome look like on cases where there's domestic violence and child welfare involvement?
Mm, that's a fantastic question. I will start by saying that reunification of the family is not necessarily the outcome that we want here. For me, it has to be always based on what the survivor wants, right? And some of them do want to reunify with the person who uses violence. Some of them don't want to, but they still want to have a parenting relationship with them, and some want nothing to do with them. So for me, at the center has to be what the survivor wants. But if we can go to a lofty goal, for me, is healing for everyone in the family, basically. Healing for the survivor, for, of course, the trauma that they endure, probably even before that relationship, but also healing for the person who causes harm. We often don't talk about healing, right? We talk about changing behavior and so, but there is such thing. It's a long road, but there's healing for them. Most of them also experience abuse and trauma when they were growing up. And of course, for child welfare, the child is at the center. So healing for that child, and particularly the opportunity for breaking that cycle of violence, right? That can be generational. For me, that's the most lofty goal that we can have. And in order to do that, a couple of things. One is concentrating in protective factors for the child, right? I mean, we know that the majority of people who cause harm grew up in abusive households, but the reverse is not true. There's a logistical fallacy there. The majority of, and I will be gender here, of boys who grow up in abusive households do not go on to be abusive themselves. So for me, that's a key question. Why? And fortunately, there's more and more research on resilience and protective factors. And probably you know that the number one protective factor is a loving relationship with an adult, hopefully the person that doesn't use violence to start with, right? So for child welfare, this has enormous implications because unfortunately we still see around the country, I won't say in Florida because I don't know, children being removed from their mothers because of failure to protect or neglect. And I tell workers, unless this is really a dangerous situation, basically you are removing the most important protective factor for that child if you're removing them from often their mother, right? So you have to be very, very careful about making that decision, right? But further, I believe, and my work has shown in some cases, that fathers who decide to take the hard work of changing and healing themselves can heal their relationship with their children. The whole Fathering After Violence project at the beginning, in addition to doing the focus groups with mothers that I mentioned, we interviewed men, fathers, who had renounced their violence and had repaired with their children. And based on that, we created basically a roadmap, very loose roadmap of reparation between the two of them. And you can imagine what it is. You have to renounce the abuse. You have to model positive behavior. You have to accept the consequences for your behavior, spell out what the impact of that behavior is, and create some kind of reparation, basically. So what I want to see is people to thrive in their lives and heal, and that is possible even after there is domestic violence.
Thank you so much for that. Is there anything that we have not covered that you would like to cover?
I like to mention one thing, that when you said that the more tools and resources workers have, the better. So we mentioned the helpline and contacted battery intervention programs. 2 or 3 years ago, I authored a workbook based on really the 20 years of work on fatherhood and domestic violence. It's called How Do You Want Your Kids to Remember You? And it's geared to fathers. It speaks directly to fathers who have been abusive and want to change and heal their relationships. It's available in their website. You go to futureswithoutviolence.org. It's for free. You can download it. It's a little hard to find, but if you go to the tab, just write work for fathers and it comes up. And even though it's geared towards and speaks directly to fathers, by and large, it has been used by many different practitioners, from supervised visitation therapists, people who work in jails, but some child welfare workers are using it. I just got an email recently of someone in Scotland, actually, that was using it in their unit. And I know the state of New Jersey is looking at using it throughout the whole child welfare system. It is very practical. It has tons of exercises. So I can imagine a child welfare worker, meeting with the father and saying, hey, look at this or look at this one chapter. And next time we meet, like, go ahead and do this exercise and let's talk about it. And it's all based on this idea of creating motivation for change and helping fathers have awareness about the harm that they're causing to their children. And I don't know if with the podcast, if you have a place where we can put a resource, we could put the link directly there.
Yes, we will put the link. You said it was hard to find. I'm like, don't worry, we will find it and we will make it accessible to folks, because I think that resource ties perfectly back into what you were saying before about child welfare workers helping fathers feel that motivation to change and supporting them in that journey, particularly as they're working alongside those more intensive intervention providers. Well, Juan Carlos, thank you so much for sharing your insights and helping us understand the role of intervention programs for those who use harm and creating safer families. I think it's a very enlightening episode for us, and I think that there's a lot of good nuggets in there for our workforce. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for inviting me. It was really a pleasure. And one last thing is that if people want to contact me, again, we can add the email link,
Absolutely.
but it's jcarean@futureswithoutviolence, one word, .org.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Juan Carlos.
Thanks so much.
If you're interested in learning more about this episode, please visit our website at ficw.fsu.edu. Thanks to Izzy Kring, Brantley Jones, and Dave Heller for their help in putting together this episode. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. I'm Dr. Lisa Magruder for the Florida Institute for Child Welfare.